Right, continuing talking about science and the scientific method and how it's involved or important for psychology. The next thing I'm going to talk about is sort of how to think like a scientist or how to think more like a scientist. And I know most students who take introductory psychology don't plan to become scientists. They don't plan to become scientific researchers. Even most psychology majors aren't planning to become psychological researchers. They're planning to do other things. And psychology majors, you do have to take, on our campus, you have to take at least 2 classes specifically about research and research methods. Why? Why do we care so much about this? There are a lot of benefits to thinking like a scientist. Or, as the textbook puts it, to be a better critical thinker, to think critically. What does that mean? Because when we think critically, we often think like, well, you're criticizing people, you're being critical, you're being mean, you're being negative. And that's not quite what it means, but it does have that association. Another term that's very important when we talk about critical thinking or sort of thinking more like a scientist is we have this term skepticism. And a lot of people, maybe you've heard this term before, but you might not know exactly what it means. A lot of people, when they hear that someone is being skeptical, they think, well, they're being negative. Or some people will say, well, that means you're closed-minded. You're not open to new ideas. And that is actually a very wrong way to describe skepticism. So skepticism is being open to new ideas if there's an important if, there's a requirement. Being open to new ideas if there is evidence for those new ideas. So skepticism is about requiring evidence, about not just accepting things blindly, not just blind faith or blind trust. So it's not being negative, it's actually being open. All right, but it's like, okay, I'm open to this new idea, but I need some evidence for it. Requiring evidence is very central. And so one of the things that the textbook that I use for class talks about is how to become a better critical thinker. Another textbook that I use when I teach research methods uses the term being a better consumer of research, because acknowledging that most of you are probably not going to go on and become researchers, but you can be a consumer of research. You know, you exist in a world where various research findings are relevant to your existence, to your functioning. Some examples of when you should care about research. When people make things like health claims, like if you see a diet ad, or you hear a friend say, hey, I lost weight with this diet, if you're into that sort of thing, you want to be a little skeptical. Like, hey, okay, interesting. Tell me about this diet. What is involved in it? And importantly, what's the evidence that it's safe and it works? And if they don't have that, that can be problematic. Also, people trying to sell you things, products, services, lifestyles. There's lots of folks trying to get you to sign on to something they're trying to sell you, trying to convince you, trying to get you to vote for somebody in some cases. Sometimes they will make claims where there's no evidence for that claim. When you think more like a scientist, you know how to better evaluate claims and products and things that perhaps people are trying to sell to you. Recently, because right now, as at the time of this recording, we've been very affected by the global coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. Lots of stuff, lots of information was being put out there where some people, students, friends, family, they would hear something and accept it blindly without questioning, and that could lead to really harmful consequences if it's an idea that is not backed by evidence, that is just some idea that somebody came up with but is not backed by research. That's that's problematic for things like health advice. And so to become a better critical thinker, the textbook that I'm using right now for this class, it has 4 specific bits of advice. I point out the specific textbook because sometimes other textbooks will have one more or one less, and those of you joining from classes that are not my own, you might have to learn things slightly differently, but overall there should be some similarities. All right, so you see a claim of some sort. Maybe it's something like, hey, this diet will make you lose a lot of weight. Or it could be something like, hey, you should vote for this person because they're going to make this thing happen. All right, so how can you be a critical thinker? How can you think more like a scientist when you're presented with a situation like that? All right, so the first thing that you should do, consider any underlying motivation for a particular claim. All right, what are some motives that would be very relevant? All right, if you believe this claim, will the person make money? If it's something they can make money from, they are very, very motivated to get you to believe in that claim, to believe that that diet works. If they want to get that candidate elected so they can get that job, that position, it's like, oh, okay, are they supporting this candidate because there's something in it for them? I always think, well, why? What is the person who made this claim, what's in it for them? If I buy into it, if I believe in this claim. You want to keep those things in mind. Take that into consideration. A big thing to consider is if there's money involved, people will get you to believe anything in some cases to get your money. So always be super skeptical when it's something you got to pay money for. Now, another thing you should do, sort of a second step or a second recommendation, evaluate the quality of the evidence used to support the claim. Now, I'm teaching this class to undergraduate students. Some of you are freshmen even. You may not feel fully qualified to evaluate research evidence, but some recommendations that I have for you. A good place to start is just a simple Google search to try to find evidence for something being true or the actual status of a claim about research or something like that, because the reality is anybody can say anything. On TV, on the internet, anybody can say, oh, scientists have found. I mean, for example, if you go on TikTok, because TikTok is shorter videos, you go on TikTok, there are all sorts of videos where they'll just say, scientists have found, or psychologists say, and that's all the information they give you. They don't tell you what that particular claim is based on. And they'll say things like, oh, colors tell you about your personality. Or one that I saw recently, and I might have already used this as an example. I apologize if I've already used this for an example. But one that I saw recently, they said, oh, only people with ADHD can unfocus their eyes at will. And lots of people saw that video and they're like, oh, that must be true. There's no evidence for that claim. And actually, people with ADHD are more likely to have problems with focusing their vision, but it is not true that only people with ADHD can unfocus their eyes at will. But you see this all the time. A friend of yours might say, oh yeah, scientists have found that. Or they might not even say scientists have found that. They'll just say, oh, and they'll state something as if it's true. When people state something confidently, we tend to assume, well, why would they lie to us? That must be true. You want to go ahead and fact check. A simple Google search is a good start. If you want stronger evidence, there's a site called Google Scholar. It's scholar.google.com. Now, the sorts of articles you're going to get from Google Scholar are going to be scientific, scholarly articles, academic articles. They're going to be probably more difficult to read than some of the stuff you'll get with regular Google. But very importantly, these are peer-reviewed articles. They are of a higher level of trustworthiness. And so if it's a really important decision, you're trying to figure out what the validity is of evidence that's been presented for a particular claim, it's a really good idea to go to Google Scholar and search for things like, you could go to Google Scholar and look up, unfocused eyes, ADHD, and see what comes up. And then you'll see, oh, okay, none of these articles are saying that unfocusing your eyes at will is like diagnostic for ADHD or unique to ADHD. All right, so in some cases it's good to go to Google Scholar. Before Google Scholar was around, a lot of these articles, you could only find them through using databases that you access through a university or medical school or research institution, and that was a problem with accessibility. Now we don't, now with Google Scholar, even if you are not affiliated with an academic institution or research institution of some sort, you can still access those articles and look for the evidence yourself. All All right, so try to find evidence for something. If somebody says, hey, you can lose weight with this book, this program, this product, look it up and be like, all right, what's the evidence for it? Sometimes you'll find the first few articles will say, this diet is dangerous. This diet is ineffective. This diet is no more effective than anything else, and everybody gained the weight back, and all sorts of things you might find. So look for the evidence. Be skeptical. Demand the evidence. Now, another bit of advice, alternative explanations. Try to generate alternative explanations for the claim or the results. So if somebody says, hey, I lost weight with this diet, we'll say, okay, what else were you doing? If they say, oh, I was also going to the gym. Okay, well, okay, that's important because that affects your weight too. Oh, and I also quit drinking beer. Okay, that is very relevant. Well, we need to know that too. So you always want to think, is there some other explanation for why this could have happened? If somebody says, hey, I tried this flu cure or COVID-19 cure and I got better, I say, okay, did you do anything else? I mean, you've also looked for the evidence on Google Scholar, hopefully, but you say, would you do anything else? And say, oh, well, I also went to my doctor and they gave me this other thing to take, but I tried this other thing too. Or it might be something like, oh yeah, after 7 days I got better. And you might think, let me go look up. If you do nothing for this particular disease, how quickly do people get better? And you might look and be like, oh, okay, you might have just gotten better on your own. It might not have been, the supplement or the product that helped you get better. And I'm not referencing anything specific here. I'm giving general examples. These are hypothetical examples. Now, finally, your advice or your steps in trying to be a better critical thinker. And this one is hard for human beings because human beings are emotional creatures. Avoid using emotions or personal experiences when evaluating a claim. This one is so hard, and scientists even have to keep this in check. Humans are emotional. Humans are biased creatures. And we tend to see our own personal experiences as particularly relevant or salient. So if you have personal experience with something, you're going to want to rely on that rather than looking at the larger body of findings that are out there. If you are thinking about like a diet program and you have a best friend who lost a bunch of weight with that diet program, you'll be like, oh, I know that person. That is the example I'm going to think about. You may not pay attention to the evidence that, 99% of people who do this diet, they don't lose any weight or they gain most of it back. We tend to think our own experiences are more important, our own values, our own opinions. If a certain claim supports or goes against your personal philosophical values, religious beliefs, you're going to look at it differently. You have your own bias. Everyone has bias. I have bias. As a human being, we all have bias, so you have to keep those in check. You have to kind of step back and say, okay, am I evaluating the evidence or am I relying on my own personal feelings, personal values? That is probably one of the most difficult steps to accomplish, because as human beings, we have a tendency to do that. But that is also an important step in critical thinking. It's also one of the reasons it's good to talk to other people, who probably have different views, different values. It's a good reason that a lot of scientists collaborate. They work on teams in their research so that we can keep each other honest and say, okay, so I notice you're really exciting about this particular hypothesis we're testing. Are you relying on your bias right now, or are you being objective? We need you to be objective. All right, so sometimes you have to keep yourself in check, and sometimes you have to keep other people in check. All of these are helpful for getting you to think more like a scientist, to think more critically, and be a better consumer of research. Even if you don't go on to become a researcher, there are definite benefits to thinking like a researcher.